deep in the valley, where the desert meets the river, where golden sands stretch endlessly toward horizons that shimmer in the heat, there flows a lifeline, the Nile. This single ribbon of water, snaking through thousands of miles of barren landscape, gave birth to one of humanity's most extraordinary civilizations. For over 3,000 years, ancient Egypt stood as a beacon of human achievement, a testament to what people could accomplish when they worked in harmony with the natural world around them. Tonight, we journey through the complete story of this remarkable civilization, from its humble beginnings as scattered villages along a riverbank, to its transformation into an empire that would shape the course of human history. The gift of the Nile. Around 6000 BCE, as the last ice age released its grip on the planet and climates began to shift, something remarkable was happening in northeastern Africa. The Sahara, which today sprawls as the world's largest hot desert, was beginning its transformation from a relatively green savanna into the arid expanse we know today. This climatic shift pushed human populations toward the one constant source of water in the region, the Nile River. These early people, nomadic hunters and gatherers who had roamed the African landscape for countless generations, began to settle along the riverbanks, drawn by the promise of reliable water and fertile soil. The Nile itself is a marvel of nature, stretching over 4,000 miles from its sources in the highlands of East Africa to its delta on the Mediterranean Sea. But what made this river truly special to the ancient Egyptians was its predictable annual cycle. Every year, like clockwork, the river would swell with floodwaters fed by seasonal rains in the Ethiopian highlands, far to the south. These floods would wash over the valley, depositing a rich, dark silt that transformed the landscape into some of the most fertile agricultural land on earth. The ancient Egyptians called their land Kemet, which means the black land, referring to this life-giving black soil. Beyond the narrow strip of cultivation lay the Deshret, the red land of the desert, harsh and unforgiving. By 5500 BCE, during what archaeologists call the pre-dynastic period, permanent settlements had begun to take root along the Nile Valley. These early farming communities discovered that they could grow wheat and barley in the rich soil, tend herds of cattle, sheep, and goats, and supplement their diet with fish from the river and wildfowl from the marshes. Archaeological excavations have revealed remarkably sophisticated pottery from this era, decorated with intricate geometric patterns and images of the Nile's wildlife. These weren't just functional vessels, they were works of art, suggesting that even in these early times, the people of the Nile Valley were developing a distinct aesthetic sensibility. The Naqada culture, which flourished between 4000 and 3100 BCE, represents a crucial phase in Egypt's development. Named after the site where it was first identified, this culture shows clear evidence of increasing social stratification and specialization. Craft workers were producing not just pottery, but also finely worked stone vessels, jewelry made from materials like gold and lapis lazuli, and cosmetic palettes carved from slate. The presence of luxury goods made from materials that had to be imported from distant regions tells us that trade networks were already extending far beyond the Nile Valley itself. Egyptian traders were making contact with peoples in Nubia to the south, the Levant to the northeast, and perhaps even Mesopotamia, that other great cradle of civilization developing between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. During the late pre-dynastic period, the Naqada culture began developing the symbols that would eventually evolve into hieroglyphic writing. Early forms of writing appeared on pottery, seals, and labels, probably used to denote ownership or record transactions. This development of writing would prove crucial, allowing the Egyptians to keep detailed records, transmit knowledge across generations, and create the rich literary culture that would flourish in later centuries. The Egypt of this period was not yet a unified nation. Instead, it comprised numerous separate kingdoms and chiefdoms, each controlling a section of the Nile Valley or Delta. Ancient Egyptian tradition held that there were originally two distinct kingdoms: Upper Egypt in the south, where the valley is narrow and the river flows between limestone cliffs, and Lower Egypt in the north, where the Nile fans out into the fertile delta. Around 3150 BCE, according to tradition and supported by archaeological evidence, these two lands were united under a single ruler named Menes, who is believed by most scholars to be the same person as Narmer, a king whose famous ceremonial palette depicts him wearing the crowns of both Upper and Lower Egypt. This unification wasn't merely a political achievement, it was the foundation upon which all of ancient Egyptian civilization would be built. The unified state established a capital at Memphis, strategically located where the valley meets the delta. From this central point, the newly established government could control river traffic, collect taxes, organize large-scale irrigation projects, and mobilize the labor force for ambitious building projects. The concept of the divine kingship, with the pharaoh serving as an intermediary between the human and divine realms, was already taking shape. Egypt had entered the early dynastic period, and the stage was set for greatness. The Age of Pyramids, the Old Kingdom, spanning from approximately 2686 to 2181 BCE, is often called the Age of Pyramids, and with good reason. This era saw the construction of the most iconic monuments of ancient Egypt, including the Great Pyramid of Giza, which would remain the tallest man-made structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. But the pyramids were more than just impressive piles of stone. They represented the culmination of rapidly advancing knowledge in mathematics, engineering, astronomy, and social organization. They stand as testament to what a unified society with a clear vision and strong central authority could achieve. The Third Dynasty, which some scholars place at the very end of the early dynastic period, and others at the beginning of the Old Kingdom, was when King Djoser commissioned the first pyramid. Before Djoser, Egyptian kings had been buried in rectangular mud brick structures called mastabas. But Djoser's architect, a brilliant man named Imhotep, had a revolutionary vision. He designed a structure that stacked 6 progressively smaller mastabas on top of each other, creating the step pyramid at Saqqara. This wasn't just architecturally innovative, it was a theological statement. The pyramid created a symbolic stairway to heaven, allowing the deceased king's spirit to ascend to join the gods. Imhotep's achievement was so remarkable that centuries later he was deified, becoming one of the very few commoners in Egyptian history to achieve god status. But it was during the Fourth Dynasty that pyramid construction reached its zenith. King Sneferu, the dynasty's founder, was a passionate builder who commissioned at least 3 major pyramids during his reign, possibly even 4. He experimented with different angles and construction techniques, learning from each project. His bent pyramid at Dashur gets its distinctive kinked shape from a mid-construction change in the angle of the sides. Scholars believe this change was likely due to structural concerns about the initial steep angle, though the exact reasoning remains debated. This wasn't a failure. It was experimentation, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of research and development. Sneferu's son Khufu took pyramid building to its ultimate expression. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built around 2560 BCE, originally stood approximately 481 feet tall, constructed from an estimated 2.3 million limestone blocks, each averaging around 2.5 tons. The precision of its construction is almost unbelievable. The base is level to within just 2.1 centimeters, and the sides are aligned to the cardinal directions with remarkable accuracy. Inside, a complex system of passages, chambers, and shafts demonstrates sophisticated architectural planning. The King's Chamber, constructed from massive granite blocks transported from quarries 500 miles away in Aswan, represents a feat of logistics and engineering that challenges comprehension even today. How did they do it? The honest answer is that we're still not entirely certain about every detail. What we do know is that it required extraordinary organization. Tens of thousands of workers had to be fed, housed, and managed. Stone had to be quarried, transported, dressed, and positioned with precision. Recent archaeological discoveries near the Giza Plateau have revealed remains of workers' villages, complete with bakeries, breweries, and what appear to be medical facilities. These weren't slaves laboring under the whip, as popular imagination often suggests, but organized teams of skilled workers and seasonal laborers, probably farmers who worked on the pyramids during the Nile's flood season, when agricultural work was impossible. Khufu's successors, his son Khafre and grandson Menkaure, continued the pyramid-building tradition at Giza. Khafre's pyramid, though slightly smaller than his father's, appears taller because it sits on higher ground. It's also guarded by one of ancient Egypt's most enigmatic monuments, the Great Sphinx. This massive sculpture, with the body of a lion and a human head believed to represent Khafre himself, has gazed across the desert for more than 4,500 years. Its meaning and purpose remain subjects of scholarly debate, though it likely represented the pharaoh's power and divine authority. The Fifth Dynasty brought changes to both pyramid construction and religious practice. The pyramids of this period were smaller and less well constructed than their Fourth Dynasty predecessors, using less solid core filling. But this era saw the rise of the solar cult of Ra, the sun god, who became increasingly central to Egyptian theology. Kings began incorporating the name of Ra into their own titles, styling themselves as Son of Ra. Solar temples were constructed alongside pyramids, and religious texts known as the pyramid texts began to appear, inscribed on the walls of burial chambers. These texts, comprising hundreds of spells and utterances designed to protect and assist the deceased king in the afterlife, represent some of the oldest religious literature in the world. During the Sixth Dynasty, power began to shift away from the central government. Provincial governors, called nomarchs, became increasingly independent and powerful. The long reign of King Pepi II, traditionally said to have ruled for 94 years, though modern scholars debate this figure and suggest it may have been considerably shorter. may have contributed to the system's breakdown. As the king aged and the central authority weakened, the nomarchs essentially became local kings in their own right, building their own tombs and conducting their own foreign policy. By around 2181 BCE, the Old Kingdom had collapsed entirely. Egypt fractured into competing power centers, ushering in what historians call the First Intermediate Period. The causes of this collapse were probably multiple: weakened central authority, drought and low Nile floods leading to famine, increased power of provincial officials, and possibly invasion or internal conflict. Egyptian texts from the subsequent Middle Kingdom period describe this as a time of chaos and disorder, though modern scholars debate how bad conditions actually were. What's certain is that the age of pyramid building was over, and Egypt would need to be reunified before it could once again achieve greatness, renewal, and prosperity. Around 2055 BCE, after more than a century of division, Egypt was reunified under a Theban prince named Mentuhotep II. This reunification marked the beginning of what would become the Middle Kingdom, though some scholars date the Middle Kingdom proper to the start of the 12th dynasty around 1985 BCE. This era is often characterized by Egyptologists as a period of cultural renaissance and classical refinement. While the Middle Kingdom didn't produce monuments as massive as the Old Kingdom pyramids, it achieved something perhaps more impressive: a relatively stable, prosperous society that lasted for several centuries. Mentuhotep II's reunification wasn't achieved overnight. The process took years of military campaigns against rival power centers, particularly the dynasty based at Heracleopolis that controlled much of northern Egypt. When Mentuhotep finally succeeded in bringing the entire country under his control, he established his capital at Thebes in Upper Egypt. This southern city, which had been relatively insignificant during the Old Kingdom, would remain important throughout the rest of Egyptian history, eventually becoming home to the great temple complexes of Karnak and Luxor. The Middle Kingdom saw significant changes in how Egypt was governed and how its people related to their rulers. The absolute authority of the Old Kingdom pharaohs was modified by a more nuanced system where powerful nobles and local officials retained considerable autonomy while still acknowledging the king's supremacy. This wasn't necessarily weakness. It was a more realistic and sustainable approach to governing a large territory, with limited communication and transportation capabilities. The 12th dynasty, beginning around 1985 BCE with King Amenemhat I, represents the peak of Middle Kingdom achievement. Amenemhat moved the capital north to a new city called Ichtawi, strategically positioned to better control both Upper and Lower Egypt. The kings of this dynasty developed a novel system to ensure smooth succession. They made their chosen heirs co-regents, ruling alongside them for several years before death. This practice helped avoid the succession disputes and civil wars that could follow a king's death. Under the 12th dynasty, Egypt expanded its borders and influence. Military campaigns pushed south into Nubia, establishing a string of massive mud brick fortresses along the Nile to secure Egypt's southern frontier and control access to Nubian gold mines. These fortresses, with their complex defensive systems and massive walls, represent sophisticated military architecture. Egypt also maintained diplomatic and trade relations with Syria, Palestine, and the Aegean world, exchanging goods and ideas with these distant cultures. The reign of Senusret III, who ruled from approximately 1878 to 1839 BCE, marked a high point of Middle Kingdom power. A warrior king, Senusret conducted multiple campaigns into Nubia, pushing Egypt's border deep into what is now Sudan. He also centralized power more effectively than his predecessors, reducing the authority of the provincial nomarchs who had become so powerful during the First Intermediate Period. Inscriptions from his reign suggest he was remembered as a model ruler, fierce in war but just in peace. His son and successor, Amenemhat III, inherited a stable, powerful kingdom and concentrated on internal development and public works. He is particularly associated with the Fayum region, an area west of the Nile where he oversaw massive irrigation and land reclamation projects. These projects transformed the Fayum into highly productive agricultural land, significantly increasing Egypt's food production capacity. Amenemhat III also conducted extensive mining operations in the Sinai Peninsula, extracting turquoise and copper. His long, peaceful reign of nearly 45 years was later remembered as a golden age. The Middle Kingdom also witnessed a democratization of religion and burial practices. During the Old Kingdom, elaborate tomb preparations and funerary texts had been the exclusive preserve of royalty. Now, wealthy nobles and even some common people could afford more elaborate burials. The coffin texts, descended from the Old Kingdom pyramid texts, were inscribed on the coffins of non-royal individuals, suggesting a belief that not just kings but all people could hope for a blessed afterlife. This period also saw the creation of some of Egypt's greatest literary works. The Tale of Sinuhe, which tells the story of an official who flees Egypt after the death of Amenemhat I and eventually returns, is considered one of the masterpieces of Middle Egyptian literature. But even the stability of the Middle Kingdom couldn't last forever. Following the death of Amenemhat III around 1797 BCE, after a reign of approximately 45 years, the dynasty weakened. His successors, including Egypt's first clearly documented female pharaoh, Sobekneferu, ruled only briefly. The reasons for the dynasty's collapse remain unclear, but may include succession problems, possibly related to Amenemhat III's long reign leaving few suitable heirs, and potentially climate changes affecting agricultural productivity. By around 1785 BCE, Egypt had again fragmented, entering what historians call the Second Intermediate Period. This time, however, Egypt faced not just internal division, but foreign invasion. A people the Egyptians called the Hyksos, meaning rulers of foreign lands, who were probably Semitic peoples from the Levant, gradually infiltrated the Nile Delta and eventually established their own dynasty. The Hyksos adopted many Egyptian customs and portrayed themselves as legitimate pharaohs, but their rule was resented by native Egyptian rulers who continued to control Upper Egypt from Thebes. The Hyksos brought with them new military technology that had developed in Western Asia. The horse-drawn chariot, the composite bow, and new types of bronze weapons. These innovations would prove decisive in future conflicts. But first, they gave the Hyksos a significant military advantage. It would take Egyptian rulers more than a century to master these new technologies and use them to expel the foreign rulers and once again unify their land. Imperial glory. The liberation of Egypt from Hyksos rule and the reunification of the country under native rulers around 1550 BCE marks the beginning of the New Kingdom, Egypt's greatest era of power and prosperity. This was the age of Egypt's transformation from a regional power into a true empire, when Egyptian armies campaigned far beyond their traditional borders, and Egyptian influence spread throughout the ancient Near East. The War of Liberation was begun by Sekenenre Tao II, a Theban king whose mummified body bears horrific head wounds that suggest he died in battle against the Hyksos. His son, Kamose, continued the struggle, pushing the Hyksos back toward the delta. But it was Kamose's successor, Ahmose I, likely Kamose's brother, though some evidence suggests he may have been his son, who finally succeeded in expelling the Hyksos entirely around 1550 BCE. Ahmose didn't just drive them from Egypt, he pursued them into southern Palestine, ensuring they couldn't regroup and return. This victory established Ahmose as the founder of the 18th dynasty and the New Kingdom. Having adopted the military innovations the Hyksos had introduced, including the chariot, the New Kingdom pharaohs embarked on an aggressive policy of expansion. Egypt had learned a hard lesson from the Hyksos invasion. The best defense was a strong offense. By controlling buffer territories in Nubia to the south and Palestine and Syria to the northeast, Egypt could prevent future invasions before they threatened the Nile Valley itself. The female pharaoh Hatshepsut, who ruled from about 1479 to 1458 BCE, represents an interesting interlude in this age of military expansion. Though she came to power as regent for her young stepson Thutmose III, Hatshepsut eventually declared herself pharaoh in her own right, complete with the traditional regalia and false beard of kingship. Rather than pursuing military conquest, Hatshepsut focused on trade, diplomacy, and monumental building projects. Her most famous achievement was a trading expedition to the land of Punt, probably located along the Red Sea coast in modern Eritrea or Somalia. This expedition returned with exotic goods including myrrh trees, ebony, ivory, and gold, commemorated in beautiful reliefs on Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. When Hatshepsut died and Thutmose III assumed sole power, he proved to be one of Egypt's greatest warrior pharaohs. His reign lasted 54 years in total, though he ruled independently for about 33 years after Hatshepsut's death around 1458 BCE. During this time, Thutmose conducted at least 17 military campaigns into Syria and Palestine. His most famous victory came at the Battle of Megiddo around 1457 BCE, where he defeated a coalition of Canaanite city-states. Egyptian inscriptions describe how Thutmose personally led the charge through a narrow mountain pass that his generals advised against, emerging behind enemy lines and routing the opposition. His campaigns pushed Egypt's borders to their greatest extent, reaching the Euphrates River in Syria and deep into Nubia in the south. The wealth flowing into Egypt from tribute, trade, and plunder was staggering. Gold from Nubia, silver from Asia, precious stones, exotic woods, incense, and slaves all poured into Egyptian treasuries. This wealth funded massive building projects, including extensive additions to the temple complex at Karnak, which was becoming the largest religious center in Egypt. The priesthood of Amun the chief god of Thebes, who had been elevated to supreme importance, grew enormously wealthy and powerful on this bounty. Egypt reached perhaps its peak of wealth and power under Amenhotep III, who ruled from 1391 to 1353 BCE. His reign of 38 years was largely peaceful, dominated by diplomacy rather than warfare. The diplomatic correspondence known as the Amarna Letters, written in Akkadian cuneiform on clay tablets, reveals a complex international system where the great powers of the era, Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and the Hittites, exchanged gifts, arranged royal marriages, and negotiated alliances. Egypt's wealth and prestige were at their height, and Amenhotep used this prosperity to fund one of the most ambitious building programs in Egyptian history. His mortuary temple on the west bank of Thebes was the largest temple ever built in Egypt, though today little remains except the two massive statues known as the Colossi of Memnon that once flanked its entrance. Then came one of the strangest episodes in Egyptian history. Amenhotep III's son, Amenhotep IV, early in his reign undertook a radical religious revolution. He elevated a previously minor solar deity called the Aten, represented simply as the disk of the sun with rays ending in hands, to supremacy, while suppressing the worship of other gods, particularly Amun. He changed his own name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten, and moved the capital from Thebes to a new city he built in Middle Egypt called Akhetaten, modern Amarna. He declared that only he, the pharaoh, could communicate with the Aten, making himself the sole intermediary between God and humanity. This religious revolution was accompanied by an artistic revolution. The stiff, formal conventions of traditional Egyptian art gave way to a new naturalistic style. Akhenaten and his famous queen, Nefertiti, were depicted with elongated skulls, protruding bellies, and spindly limbs, perhaps accurate representations of genetic conditions, or perhaps symbolic statements about the royal family's uniqueness. Scenes showed the royal family in intimate domestic settings, Akhenaten kissing Nefertiti, the couple playing with their daughters. Nothing like this had ever appeared in Egyptian art before. But while Akhenaten focused on his religious revolution, the empire began to fray. The Amarna letters include increasingly desperate pleas from Egyptian vassals in Syria and Palestine, begging for military support against various threats. These pleas went largely unanswered. The Hittite Empire, based in Anatolia, modern Turkey, took advantage of Egypt's distraction to expand its own influence in Syria. At home, the suppression of traditional religion alienated the powerful priesthood and much of the population. The Aten, a distant, abstract solar disk, lacked the personal appeal of the traditional gods who had served Egyptian needs for millennia. After Akhenaten's death, around 1336 BCE, the religious revolution was swiftly reversed. His son, who had been born Tutankhaten, changed his name to Tutankhamun, signaling the restoration of the god Amun. The court abandoned Akhetaten and returned to Thebes. Akhenaten's name was deliberately erased from monuments, his city abandoned to the desert sands. Tutankhamun himself is famous today primarily because his tomb, discovered nearly intact by Howard Carter in 1922, revealed the incredible wealth lavished on even a relatively minor pharaoh's burial. But Tutankhamun was a young king who died at approximately 18 or 19 years of age, and his actual impact on Egyptian history was minimal. The powerful General Horemheb eventually seized the throne, completing the restoration of traditional religion and setting Egypt back on course. When he died without an heir, power passed to his vizier Ramses I, beginning the 19th dynasty. Ramses I ruled only 2 years, but his son Seti I and grandson Ramses II would restore Egypt to greatness. Ramses II, who ruled for an extraordinary 66 or 67 years from approximately 1279 to 1213 BCE, is often considered Egypt's greatest pharaoh. He was a prolific builder, whose monuments still dominate the Egyptian landscape, from the massive rock-cut temples at Abu Simbel in the far south, with their colossal statues of the king, to the great hypostyle hall at Karnak with its forest of towering columns. Ramesses fathered over 100 children and lived into his 90s, an extraordinary lifespan for the ancient world. Ramesses fought a famous battle against the Hittite Empire at Kadesh in Syria around 1274 BCE. Egyptian records present this as a great victory, with Ramesses personally turning the tide when his army was ambushed and nearly destroyed. Hittite records tell a different story. Modern scholars generally view the battle as inconclusive, with neither side achieving decisive victory. What followed, however, was more significant than the battle itself: the world's first surviving peace treaty. The Treaty of Kadesh, signed between Ramesses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III, established a lasting peace between the two powers and was sealed by Ramesses marrying 2 Hittite princesses. Copies of this treaty exist in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform, and a copy hangs in the United Nations building in New York as a symbol of international diplomacy. The 20th dynasty saw Egypt increasingly on the defensive. Ramesses III, who ruled from 1186 to 1155 BCE, was the last truly powerful New Kingdom pharaoh. He faced invasions by the mysterious Sea Peoples, groups who had devastated other civilizations around the eastern Mediterranean. Ramesses defeated these invaders in both land and naval battles, but the effort exhausted Egypt's resources. The cost of constant warfare, combined with climate changes that affected agricultural productivity, gradually weakened the state. A series of increasingly weak kings named Ramesses followed, unable to maintain Egypt's empire or even full control over Egypt itself. The first recorded labor strike in history occurred in the 29th year of Ramesses III's reign, when workers building royal tombs stopped work because their rations hadn't been paid. By the end of Ramesses XI's reign around 1077 BCE, Egypt had effectively split, with the high priest of Amun controlling the south from Thebes, while the pharaoh's authority was limited to the north. The new kingdom, and with it Egypt's age as a great empire, had come to an end. Daily life, culture, and belief. To truly understand ancient Egypt, we must look beyond the monuments and political history to the daily lives of the people who built this remarkable civilization. While the grand temples and elaborate royal tombs have survived the millennia, they can give us a somewhat distorted view. Most Egyptians didn't live in palaces or concern themselves primarily with preparing for the afterlife. They were farmers and craftspeople, priests and soldiers, scribes and servants, all living within a complex social structure that had evolved over thousands of years. Egyptian society was hierarchical, with the pharaoh at its apex. The king wasn't merely a political ruler, he was considered a living god, the essential link between the human and divine realms. Below the pharaoh came the vizier, essentially the prime minister, who handled much of the day-to-day administration of government. Then came the nobles, including provincial governors and high officials, the priests who served the gods in the temples, and the scribes who kept the elaborate records necessary for running a complex state. The vast majority of Egyptians were farmers, working the rich soil along the Nile. The agricultural year was divided into 3 seasons based on the river's cycle. Akhet, the inundation when the Nile flooded; Peret, the growing season when crops were planted and tended; and Shemu, the harvest. During Akhet, when their fields were underwater, farmers often worked on state projects like building pyramids or temples, or maintaining irrigation canals. This wasn't slave labor. It was a form of taxation through labor service. Ancient Egyptians lived mostly in simple mud brick houses. The wealthy might have larger homes with multiple rooms, courtyards, and even pools, but most ordinary Egyptians lived in more modest dwellings. Furniture was simple: stools, low tables, storage chests, and bed frames strung with rope or leather straps. People slept on linen sheets and used headrests rather than pillows. Houses had flat roofs where families could sleep during hot summer nights and where grain might be stored. Clothing was simple and adapted to Egypt's hot climate. Men typically wore a linen kilt or loincloth, while women wore simple linen dresses. Linen, made from flax that grew well in Egypt, was the standard fabric. The wealthy wore finer, more elaborately pleated linen, sometimes so fine it was nearly transparent, and adorned themselves with jewelry made from gold, semi-precious stones, and colored glass. Both men and women wore makeup, particularly kohl eyeliner, which served both aesthetic and practical purposes, helping to reduce the glare of the sun. The Egyptian diet was based on bread and beer. Bread came in many varieties made from emmer wheat or barley. Beer, also made from barley or emmer, was thick and nutritious, drunk through straws to filter out the solid matter. These staples were supplemented with vegetables like onions, leeks, garlic, cucumbers, and lettuce, legumes like lentils and chickpeas, and fruits including dates, figs, and grapes. Fish from the Nile was common, as was waterfowl from the marshes. Meat from cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs was more expensive and eaten less frequently by common people, though the wealthy enjoyed it regularly. Religion permeated every aspect of Egyptian life, but it was a very different religion from the monotheistic faiths most modern people are familiar with. The Egyptians were polytheistic, worshipping a pantheon of gods and goddesses who could number in the hundreds or even thousands. Different gods were associated with different places, aspects of nature, human activities, and abstract concepts. The sun god Ra, the god of the dead Osiris, the goddess of magic Isis, the sky goddess Nut, the earth god Geb, the fertility god Min, the wisdom god Thoth. These, and many others, received worship and offerings. Central to Egyptian religious thought was the concept of Ma'at, a word that encompasses truth, justice, harmony, and cosmic order. Ma'at was both a concept and a goddess, depicted with an ostrich feather on her head. Maintaining Ma'at was the pharaoh's primary duty, but every Egyptian had a responsibility to uphold it through proper behavior. Living in accordance with Ma'at meant fulfilling one's social obligations, acting justly toward others, and performing the proper religious rituals. The Egyptians' elaborate beliefs about death and the afterlife shaped much of their culture. They believed that each person possessed several spiritual components: the Ka, a person's life force; the Bai, roughly equivalent to personality or soul; and the Ache, the transfigured spirit that could exist in the afterlife. For these spiritual aspects to survive death, the physical body needed to be preserved, hence the practice of mummification. The process involved removing internal organs, drying the body with natron salt, and wrapping it in linen bandages. The entire process could take 70 days, but preserving the body was just the beginning. The deceased needed to be buried with supplies for the afterlife: food, drink, clothing, furniture, and, in the case of the wealthy, servants in the form of Ushabti figurines that would magically come to life to do work in the afterlife. They needed funerary texts, spells to help them navigate the dangerous journey through the underworld. Most importantly, they needed to pass the judgment of Osiris. In this final test, described in funerary texts, the deceased's heart was weighed against Ma'at's feather of truth. According to these texts, if the heart was burdened with wrongdoing and outweighed the feather, it would be devoured by the demon Ammit, and the person would face oblivion. If the heart balanced the feather, the deceased could enter the field of reeds, a paradise where they would live forever in a perfected version of Egypt. Egyptian science and technology were remarkably advanced. In medicine, they identified numerous diseases and developed treatments for many of them. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, a medical text from the Middle Kingdom, describes 48 different cases of injuries and ailments, with diagnoses, prognoses, and treatments that show a surprisingly modern understanding of anatomy and healing. Egyptian doctors specialized in treating specific conditions, and some were renowned enough that foreign rulers requested their services. In mathematics, the Egyptians developed a sophisticated understanding of geometry, necessary for their surveying and construction projects. They calculated the area of circles and triangles, understood the concept of pi, though their approximation was slightly off, and could solve complex problems involving fractions. Their mathematical texts show they enjoyed mathematical puzzles as intellectual exercises, not just practical applications. The Egyptians measured time with water clocks and sundials, divided the day and night into 12 hours each, and developed a calendar of 365 days divided into 12 months of 30 days plus 5 extra days. They mapped the stars and associated many of them with their gods, and they understood that the heliacal rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, coincided with the Nile's annual flood, using this celestial event to predict the inundation. Writing was central to Egyptian civilization. Hieroglyphic script, with its complex system of ideograms and phonetic symbols, was used for monuments and religious texts. For everyday purposes, scribes used hieratic, a cursive form of hieroglyphs that could be written much more quickly. Later, an even more simplified script called Demotic developed. Scribes were highly valued members of society, for literacy was the key to advancement. Boys, and occasionally girls, from wealthy families attended schools where they learned to read and write by copying texts. As one teaching text put it, be a scribe. Your body will be sleek, your hand will be soft. You are one with the rest of your days will be spent in gladness. Your feet are firm on the ground. The long decline. The end of the New Kingdom around 1077 BCE marked the beginning of a long period of fragmentation and decline. Egypt would never again achieve the unified power and international prestige it had enjoyed during the New Kingdom. The third intermediate period, spanning from approximately 1077 to 664 BCE, saw Egypt divided among competing power centers, with brief periods of reunification followed by renewed fracturing. The initial division saw the high priests of Amun effectively ruling southern Egypt from Thebes, while a dynasty of kings ruled the north from Tanis in the delta. These northern kings, known as the 21st dynasty, may have had Libyan ancestry, possibly descended from mercenary soldiers and prisoners of war who had been settled in Egypt during the New Kingdom, though their exact origins remain debated among scholars. Despite the political division, both North and South maintained the fiction of Egyptian unity, and there's little evidence of open warfare between them. The 22nd dynasty, beginning around 945 BCE, was definitely of Libyan origin. Its founder, Shoshenq I, managed to reunify Egypt and even conducted military campaigns into Palestine, mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as the campaign of Shishak, who plundered the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. But after Shoshenq, the dynasty's power fragmented. Multiple lines of kings ruled simultaneously in different parts of Egypt, with the 23rd and 24th dynasties running parallel to the later 22nd dynasty. In the 8th century BCE, a new power emerged from the south. The kingdom of Kush, based at Napata in what is now Sudan, had developed its own distinct culture but maintained strong connections to Egypt. Under King Paye, also known as Pianki, the Kushite rulers launched a campaign north, eventually conquering most of Egypt and establishing the 25th dynasty. These Kushite pharaohs, far from being foreign barbarians, were deeply committed to Egyptian culture and religion. They saw themselves as restorers of ancient Egyptian traditions that had been neglected, and they undertook an extensive program of temple building and restoration. But Egypt's weakness had attracted the attention of the rising Assyrian Empire, the dominant military power of the Near East in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. Between 671 and 667 BCE, the Assyrian kings Esarhaddon and his successor Ashurbanipal launched invasions of Egypt. The Assyrians possessed the most effective military forces of the era, equipped with iron weapons, sophisticated siege techniques, and cavalry. They drove the Kushite pharaohs back to Nubia and sacked Thebes in 663 BCE, carrying away vast amounts of treasure. This was a devastating blow, both materially and psychologically. Egypt, which had dominated the region for so long, had been conquered by foreigners. The Assyrians didn't try to rule Egypt directly. Instead, they installed native Egyptian rulers as vassals, a group known as the Sayyid kings of the 26th dynasty, ruling from the city of Sais in the delta. When Assyrian power weakened in the face of Babylonian and Median pressure, King Sesamtic I was able to assert Egyptian independence around 653 BCE, using Greek and Carian mercenaries to do so. The Sayete period, as the 26th dynasty is known, saw a remarkable cultural renaissance. The Sate kings deliberately harked back to the Old Kingdom, copying the art and inscriptions of that distant era in a conscious attempt to reconnect with Egypt's glorious past. They reopened old quarries, restored ancient monuments, and revived archaic titles and administrative practices. Greek traders and mercenaries settled in Egypt in significant numbers, establishing the city of Naucratis as a Greek trading center in the Delta. Egypt was becoming more cosmopolitan, more connected to the wider Mediterranean world. But independence was short-lived. In 525 BCE, the Persian Empire, having conquered Babylon and established itself as the greatest power in the Near East, turned its attention to Egypt. King Cambyses II led the Persian invasion, defeating the Egyptian pharaoh Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium. Egypt became a satrapy, a province of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, beginning what Egyptians counted as the 27th dynasty. Persian rule was resented by many Egyptians, though later Greek writers like Herodotus probably exaggerated Persian oppression. The Persians actually showed considerable respect for Egyptian culture and religion, with Persian kings sometimes portrayed in Egyptian style as traditional pharaohs. But there were periodic Egyptian revolts, and periods when Egypt managed to regain independence. The 28th, 29th, and 30th dynasties were native Egyptian rulers who successfully rebelled against Persian rule, though their independence was precarious and frequently threatened. The last native Egyptian dynasty, the 30th, ended in 343 BCE when the Persians reconquered Egypt. This second Persian period, called the 31st dynasty, was brief. Just 11 years later, in 332 BCE, a new conqueror arrived. Alexander the Great of Macedonia. The young Macedonian king was in the process of destroying the Persian Empire, and Egypt was one of his conquests. But unlike the Persians, Alexander would usher in an entirely new era in Egyptian history. The final chapters. Alexander the Great arrived in Egypt in 332 BCE not as a foreign invader, but as a liberator, freeing the Egyptians from hated Persian rule. The Persian satrap surrendered without a fight, and the Egyptians welcomed Alexander with open arms. The young conqueror showed great respect for Egyptian religion and culture. He made offerings to the gods at Memphis, was crowned pharaoh in traditional Egyptian style, and, most importantly, made a pilgrimage to the Oracle of Amun at the Siwa Oasis in the western desert. There, according to tradition, the oracle confirmed that Alexander was the son of Amun, effectively declaring him a god in Egyptian terms. Alexander spent only a few months in Egypt, but his impact was profound. He founded a new city on the Mediterranean coast at a strategic site with excellent harbors, which he named Alexandria after himself. Designed according to Greek urban planning principles with a grid layout, it would become Egypt's new capital and one of the great cities of the ancient world. Alexander left Macedonia officials in charge of Egypt and departed to continue his conquest of the Persian Empire. He never returned. He died in Babylon in 323 BCE at the age of just 32, having conquered much of the known world. After Alexander's death, his empire immediately began to fragment as his generals fought for control of different regions. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most trusted companions. Ptolemy moved quickly to consolidate his power, and when Alexander's supposed heir, Alexander IV, was murdered, Ptolemy declared himself king in 305 BCE, founding the Ptolemaic dynasty. He also secured Alexander's body, which was eventually entombed in Alexandria, giving his dynasty added legitimacy as guardians of the great conqueror's memory. The Ptolemaic period was a fascinating blend of Greek and Egyptian cultures. The Ptolemies were thoroughly Greek in culture, language, and outlook. Greek was the language of government and the court, and Alexandria became one of the great centers of Hellenistic Greek culture. The famous Library of Alexandria, established under Ptolemy I and expanded by his successors, became the largest library in the ancient world, gathering hundreds of thousands of scrolls and attracting scholars from across the Mediterranean. The Mouseion, a research institute associated with the library, supported scholars in fields ranging from mathematics and astronomy to medicine and literature. Euclid wrote his Elements of Geometry in Alexandria. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy. Aristarchus proposed the then radical theory that the earth revolves around the sun. But while the Ptolemies were Greek, they also presented themselves as traditional Egyptian pharaohs. They funded the construction and restoration of temples throughout Egypt, depicted themselves in Egyptian artistic style on temple walls, participated in Egyptian religious festivals, and gave their children both Greek and Egyptian royal names. The result was a unique cultural synthesis. New gods emerged, like Serapis, who combined aspects of Greek and Egyptian deities. Greek and Egyptian communities coexisted in Egypt's cities, sometimes intermarrying and blending their cultures. The Ptolemaic period saw Egypt become wealthy again through Mediterranean trade. Alexandria's harbors handled goods from across the known world. Egyptian grain fed much of the Mediterranean basin. The dynasty maintained a powerful navy and at times controlled territories in Cyprus, parts of Asia Minor, and the eastern Mediterranean coast. The early Ptolemies were strong rulers who maintained Egypt as a major Mediterranean power. But the dynasty had a fatal flaw: bitter internal conflicts. Ptolemaic family members routinely plotted against, imprisoned, and murdered each other in struggles for power. Siblings married siblings to keep the dynasty pure, but then fought vicious civil wars. By the 2nd century BCE, the dynasty was increasingly dysfunctional, kept afloat only by Egypt's immense agricultural wealth. And increasingly, the rising power of Rome was taking an interest in Egypt's affairs. By the 1st century BCE, Egypt had effectively become a client state of Rome, its independence existing only because Rome chose not to annex it outright. Yet, the last Ptolemaic ruler, Cleopatra VII, who came to power in 51 BCE, was brilliant, charismatic, and politically astute. Ancient sources tell us she was the first Ptolemaic ruler in nearly 3 centuries who learned to speak Egyptian, giving her a connection to her native subjects that her Greek-speaking predecessors had lacked. She fought civil wars against her brothers and sisters, allied herself with Julius Caesar, bore him a son, and, after Caesar's assassination, allied herself with Mark Antony. Cleopatra and Antony's ambitions brought them into conflict with Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, in a power struggle for control of the Roman world. In 31 BCE, the decisive battle came at Actium, off the coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra's forces were defeated, and the couple fled back to Egypt. As Octavian pursued them to Alexandria, they committed suicide. Antony died from a self-inflicted sword wound. Cleopatra's death followed soon after, traditionally said to have been by the bite of an asp, though the exact method remains uncertain among historians. Octavian, soon to become the Emperor Augustus, annexed Egypt as a personal possession of the Roman Emperor in 30 BCE. Egypt was now a province of Rome, but a very special one. It was the breadbasket of the empire, its grain feeding the city of Rome itself. Because Egypt was so important and so wealthy, Augustus decreed that no senator could visit without his express permission, lest some ambitious Roman use Egypt's resources to challenge imperial power. Alexandria remained a great city, second only to Rome itself in size and importance. The Ptolemaic administrative system continued to function, now serving Roman rather than Egyptian masters. Egyptian traditional culture continued, though slowly declining. Temples still functioned and traditional religion was still practiced. But gradually, over centuries, the old ways faded. Christianity spread through Egypt in the early centuries CE, and by the 4th century had become the dominant religion. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE at the Temple of Isis at Philae. The knowledge of how to read hieroglyphs was lost, and with it direct access to thousands of years of Egyptian history and wisdom. Egypt had become a Christian land, and later, after the Arab conquest of 641 CE, an Islamic one. The civilization of the Pharaohs had ended. Legacy and rebirth. For more than 1,000 years, ancient Egypt was forgotten, its monuments slowly being buried by desert sands, its cities crumbling into dust, its writings indecipherable. Medieval and Renaissance Europeans knew of Egypt only through biblical references and the writings of Greek and Roman authors. Egypt became a land of mystery and legend, its pyramids attributed to everyone from biblical patriarchs to visitors from lost continents. The rediscovery of ancient Egypt began with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. Napoleon brought with him not just soldiers but scholars, artists, and scientists, who studied and recorded everything they found. Though Napoleon's military campaign failed, the scholarly expedition was a triumph, culminating in the multi-volume Description de l'Égypte that revealed ancient Egyptian civilization to Europe. The breakthrough in understanding came in 1822, when a French scholar named Jean-François Champollion deciphered the Rosetta Stone, a decree written in hieroglyphic, Demotic Egyptian, and Greek. By comparing the three scripts, Champollion cracked the code of hieroglyphics, giving scholars the key to read the countless inscriptions covering Egypt's monuments. Ancient Egypt could finally speak again. Since then, archaeology and scholarship have pieced together the story of this remarkable civilization. Every year brings new discoveries: hidden chambers in pyramids, intact tombs, entire cities preserved beneath the sand. DNA analysis reveals the genetic heritage of the ancient Egyptians. Computer modeling recreates how the pyramids were built. Modern medical imaging allows us to examine mummies without unwrapping them. Each discovery adds to our understanding of how the ancient Egyptians lived, what they believed, and how they created a civilization that endured for 3 millennia. The legacy of ancient Egypt is all around us. They gave us a 365-day calendar that, with modifications, we still use. Their contributions to mathematics, medicine, and engineering influenced all subsequent civilizations. Their concept of monumental architecture, of building structures meant to last forever, inspired builders from ancient Rome to modern times. Their sophisticated understanding of bureaucracy and administration provided models for later empires. Their art, with its distinctive style and symbolism, continues to fascinate and inspire. But perhaps ancient Egypt's greatest legacy is simply the example they provide of what human civilization can achieve. For over 3,000 years, through times of triumph and disaster, unity and division, the civilization of the Nile endured. They created monuments that still stand today, wrote literature that still moves us, developed systems of thought that still intrigue us. They faced the fundamental questions of human existence. Why are we here? What happens when we die? How should we live? And created answers that satisfied millions of people across thousands of years. As you drift off to sleep tonight, spare a thought for those ancient people living along the Nile, watching the same stars we see, asking the same questions we ask, building a civilization that would echo across the ages. Their monuments may have crumbled, their empire may have fallen, but the memory of what they achieved lives on, inspiring wonder and awe in all who encounter it. If you enjoyed this journey through ancient Egypt, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Ancient Curiosities. Let us know in the comments which ancient civilization you'd like us to explore next. Until then, sleep well and dream of pyramids rising from the desert sands, of the Nile flowing eternally, and of a civilization that achieved immortality not through their beliefs about the afterlife, but through the enduring power of their achievements. Sweet dreams and good night.